Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen. Welcome to Module 4, where we talk about crime fighters. This is where we get into stereotypes of police and others and kind of how to better understand them in our society. So let's get started. So some of you may have some awareness of the Police Academy movies back in the 1980s. That is one of many portrayals that we're going to be looking at, some of the themes we see, and then analyzing what the result of those portrayals are. But this is a series of movies that was really made for comedy purposes, but we call these police officers lampooned police. And this is not to say you couldn't enjoy these films in your own right, but we have to understand how they fit the context and the narrative of our perceptions of police work. All right. So as far as crime fighting is concerned, crime fighting is the second most popular media subject. It requires very low public knowledge, but very high visibility, right? You don't have to know a lot about how this works, but it's very visible. You'll see it. And essentially, crime fighters, not only police, but others, are soldiers in a war on crime, and they are very much iconified that way. We will talk about competing media frames or portraits as far as what those constructions are, borrowing from some of the social constructionism language back in the earlier chapters. And we're going to talk about the conflicting messages, the stereotypes, and then we'll also talk about multiple legal actors playing the crime fighter role, including the role of citizens. Now, one thing that we need to understand is you have a lot of crime fighting going on and portrayals based on that, and some of the earliest ones actually were heavily scrutinized by commissions. Okay, but let's look at some of what we have to begin with here, and your text does a good job of getting you started. So we have lots of crime stories out there. You know, you certainly have mysteries, intrigue, detective tales, crime thrillers, modernized westerns, revenge stories, vigilante stories, action crime stories, and then certainly superheroes. So there has always been a captivation by American society with these kinds of tales, and I can fully admit that I enjoy watching a lot of these types of films. And again, this class should not ruin that for you, but just help you place it maybe in a way that you hadn't thought about before. Essentially, successful crime fighters are usually portrayed as loners, that they have to kind of take things into their own hands and that the system is somehow corrupt or broken, or at least ineffective at doing a really good job of fighting crime. Essentially, crime is a social evil. It's not a societal problem, and it must be destroyed. And it really goes at the heart of the criminal, the perversion of their soul, the psychotic personality out there. It's not to be solved at a community level. It also begs the question of criminal extermination, which is an extreme way of looking at this. But this is kind of the story that is woven into the fabric of these types of portrayals. We also have a line that kind of helps us think about crime is not a world for standard operating procedures. Again, we have to take shortcuts. We have to go against the law, playing judge, jury, and executioner sometimes, and that really the stakes are too high for due process, and that there clearly are people that are better off dead and that are too dangerous to be left alive, too unpredictable, thereby justifying their killing or the violence used against them. And of course, in the entertainment industry, we see a high use of violence, and particularly guns. What's funny is if you read any number of actor, action hero interviews, many of them who even have trained professionally as fighters, maybe in martial arts or whatnot, will tell you half of what they do is really good camera angles and heavily rehearsed fight choreography in which you can get injured doing. But they all tend to come to the same conclusion, in that if I got hit like that in real life, there is no way I'd be getting up in the next second and continuing to fight. I'd be out. You know, some of those hits or portrayals of the hits that you see are not recoverable. And so we get a false sense of recovery and resilience from people because the fight has to be longer than just a few seconds or a few minutes for it to be entertaining. But they said, unfortunately, it makes it look like people can take beatings really heavily and that they can always get back up. And the reality is that's not true. I mean, they say that would land you in the hospital. You wouldn't even walk up, away from that. You wouldn't wake up. You'd be killed. And so we have to think about violence as realistic or not. Now, I'm going to read something from your text, which is really important. This is when we first started to see these kinds of portrayals of crime fighting. And essentially, when we started to have major theater and film depicting police and crime, there was an incredible response to this in the 30s. And so there was a commission called the Hays Commission. And this Hays Commission heavily criticized the movie industry for glorifying criminals and encouraging copycat crime. So if you look at box 5.1, it gives you a description of this. So the Hays Code was adopted by major American movie studios in response to the criticisms voiced by this commission. It imposed severe limitations on crime and justice in movies. The first general principle was no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. And principle 2 was correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. And number 3, law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. That's interesting because that's pretty much out the door today. But yeah, I mean, there was kind of this Hollywood code that the FBI always get their man. And it was very strictly adhered to for a long time as far as a standard to work from. The Hays Code also talked about crimes against the law, that these should never be presented in a way as to throw sympathy with the crime as against the law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire for imitation. Murder, the technique, cannot be presented in a way that would inspire imitation. Brutal killings are not to be presented in detail. Revenge in modern terms shall not be justified. Methods of crime should not be explicitly presented. They can be described. So theft, robbery, safecracking, dynamiting of trains, mines, buildings should not be detailed in method. Arson must subject to the same safeguards. The use of firearms shall be restricted to the essentials, whatever that means. Methods of smuggling should not be presented. Illegal drug trafficking must never be presented. And so this was the William H. Hays President's Report to the Motion Picture Producer and Distributor Association of America. So when you understand that history of the Hays Commission, you can start to see why crime and crime fighting was portrayed in so many movies for so long. It gives you the history behind that. Let's go into the competing frames and portraits. So the first one is good cop versus bad cop, right? So the good cop is a competent police officer in a competent criminal justice system, doing the right thing in the right way, with a high emphasis on catching the bad guy and due process. You also have the bad cop, which illustrates corrupt police, a corrupt criminal justice system that works at the will of whoever is in power or in control of it. And essentially, this extends into not only bad cop, but bad judge or bad prosecutor. And essentially, the only way to write this is to bring an outsider bringing justice, right? That we have to fix it from the outside in because it's so corrupt in the inside. We also have competing frames and portraits of conflict number 2, the criminal justice professional versus private citizens. So the Hays Commission, which we just read about, really enhanced the criminal justice professional side, showing how competent police officers were. But later on, this started to dissolve into private citizens being just as capable. So in the first conflict, as a criminal justice professional, it showed really a super criminal justice system, and it also featured more prominently the roles of attorneys, judges, correctional officers, and police. But then the other conflict was when these people are not capable or doing an efficient job, then we bring in the civilian crime fighters because of a bad criminal justice system to take the law into their own hands and make the world a better place for it. So this is some tension that's created in media as well. We also have competing frames that produce competing messages. So the overarching message here is that crime can only be solved in or through the criminal justice system, and that's the only way to deal with it. So that's kind of the professional side. But the competing message is that the criminal justice system is incompetent. People must protect themselves and fight crime themselves, and that's the only way to stay safe and rid the world of evil. And so sometimes we're left trying to figure out which one we should subscribe to, or we subscribe to certain ones in certain situations or times. So again, this is part of that woven fabric of stereotypes that we see often in the media. Going back to lampooned police, this is where we see comedy on an entire profession. So you get foolish, slapstick character police officers that are not to be taken seriously, that are completely bumbling in the work they do, if not jeopardizing the work they do. They really allow for serious issues to be discussed in a less threatening context. So that was really the whole plot, not only to deliver comedy, but also to start to show some of the human side of it, but then you take it too far and it becomes overly dramatic or overly silly. And law enforcement may object if reflecting a reality of incompetence or undermining public support if it gets taken too far. And so, everyone has a sense of humor, but if people start to have their trust undermined, or we're suspicious of police or the training that they have and their ability to protect, then it really doesn't do them any favors. We also have the G-Men and the films called police procedurals that were highly into that process, whether it was due process or the process of investigation. So remember, G-Men are really short for government men, really painting them as superheroes, effective professional crime busters. This is partly a response to the media glorification of criminals and trying to say, well, we need to paint a strong professional to juxtapose that criminal so that people feel safe again. So this was a shift from officer friendly, being your community officer that was, supportive and happy to help, getting little cats out of trees and those sorts of things, and helping little old ladies cross the street, to professionals who are tackling serious issues and community social problems. Typically, this is not local police officers. It's usually federal agents that are in this kind of a frame. And so this is kind of where we start to move further and further into crime dramas that we started to see in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially with glamorizing federal police work or federal law enforcement. With G-Men and police procedurals, you also see just police procedures portraying that backstage reality of police investigation in a dramatic media portrait. So remember, this earlier, this was not a time for CSI, for DNA evidence to appear, and that sort of a thing. But we were very fascinated by evidence collection, by climactic investigation, and those sorts of things. And so the public became more and more interested in that process and in kind of the clever way that people would go about linking a suspect pool to a crime scene. This also had civilians involved as victims. And so when they were wronged or they weren't given justice, we saw them portrayed in these types of police procedural films as well, where maybe they start to act out and it kind of twists the story or brings more drama. This also brought into play expert policing, where a police was kind of a scientific genius, knowing more than the general public, which in a way accelerated a stereotype that wasn't accurate either, where people felt like they had every tool at their disposal, that they were highly educated and secretly intelligent beyond typical human intelligence, so it could exacerbate an idea that they should be able to do everything and be everything for everybody, which is a really unfair expectation to have of the police, because as you and I know, the average education level for a police officer is some college, meaning somewhere between high school diploma and a bachelor's degree. Now, more and more officers have bachelor's degrees, and certainly federal agents have to have bachelor's degrees, and many have master's degrees or law degrees. And this wasn't always the case over time. This started to change, especially since the 1990s. But to put them on some pedestal as some kind of nuclear physicist wasn't really the best stereotype to put them in, because then people feel like anything less than that was dissatisfying. And again, an unfair portrayal. When we look at films like Cops, Cops has actually been around for a long time, and it's really an action reality version of police on the job. So we saw it in the 1970s. It kind of hit its heyday in the 1980s, and you can still see it around today, and they go to different jurisdictions, and you get to watch filming of law enforcement reality. But remember, there is editing that goes on, and they certainly don't show you all the due process and what happens to the person after they are apprehended. So after we got through the lampoons and we had the professional G-men, we started to see a series of the return of competent local law enforcement. So a movement away from those federal agents back to local police. But then we saw them a little bit more brutal than they should be. And this makes sense to us because in the 60s we came out of an era that was filled with violence and upheaval and a lot of social chaos and social movement, where police were called in to kind of babysit and take care of the rallies and people that were doing civil disobedience type stuff. And so that kind of informed the 70s as to how they would be portrayed. So we portrayed local police as aggressive, crime fighting, a take no prisoners soldiers, shoot point blank type force, which again is not accurate either. And crime was really portrayed as the result of evil or weak individuals making poor choices. This is where we kind of started to see some more identification with the criminal as being maybe a victim of the system or a victim of a society or a family that let them down, that was not supported socially. We also see some blame going into these older, or what we call veteran crime fighters, responsible for initiating naive civilian recruits. And so you start to see some skepticism for incoming police academies, as far as you're just getting quote unquote young bucks who are trigger happy, that want to take matters into their own hands, that have a chip on their shoulder and that are ready to be fulfilled in bossing people around and gunning them into handcuffs all day. And so these kinds of stereotypes started to proliferate media as well. Finally, we have media framing as cop narratives. And your text goes into a lot of detail for this, so I'm just going to hit the highlights. But you'll want to read about this because it will help you with your assignments coming up. So these are a few of the narratives. You have your rogues, officers who go off on their own in pursuit of criminals and justice, and so they don't follow orders, but then they're praised or rewarded for not following orders, and so not following orders is justified. You also have corrupt cops, or officers who join the dark side forces of crime and evil, who can be bought, or who are running a criminal enterprise on the side while simultaneously working as law enforcement in the system, and maybe using the system to benefit their criminal enterprise. You also have honest cops, where we kind of empathize with some of the difficulties and the unpleasantries of being in law enforcement and the hardships of cops who try to do the right thing in a corrupt culture and are fighting against the shortcuts and the dishonesty and the cheap ways of doing things. We also had buddy cops, where we would pair kind of opposites attract partners together, and you would work off the conflicts and complications from opposite personalities who are forced to work together. We see this in a lot of films where often race plays a huge role in police culture, where you may have a white cop and a black cop, or a kind of poor inner city cop with a white suburban cop, or maybe an Asian cop from kind of an underground culture with a black cop from an inner city culture. You see a lot of films that juxtapose two different cultures or norms together, and often there's some comedy in there, or they play off each other's strengths or weaknesses. Comedy and comedy action films, you had some slapstick violence, as far as how people were able to knock people out in kind of a silly way. Lots of explosions and stunts, and the bad guys were injured, but the law enforcement always get up and walk away with minor bruises and cuts, maybe a little more slowly, but again, action heroes will say there's no way that guy would be getting up. Finally, we have the female cop or the aging cop. So we're seeing this play out as well. Oftentimes, female cops might have had very, very small cameos in films where it was used more for humor, where someone gets pulled over, oh no, a female cop is coming up to my driver's side, and then lots of jokes and stereotypes start spilling out about female cops. We've also seen female cops kind of sexualized. We've seen them also kind of masculinized, or kind of fighting off their own femininity, or being forced to choose between masculinity and femininity. And this is also a very intriguing story for the public to watch. And the aging cop, that narrative is often where you have a cop that really isn't as physically capable as they used to be, but they are kind of the holder of all knowledge, and they're the ones that really solve the crimes. And really kind of keeping a lid on things and keeping the investigation going. It's kind of the old wise cop that really has the experience and knowledge to pull off justice. Wrapping up here, we're going to talk about journalism and news. This is our last slide. So as far as journalism goes, we saw the advent of true crime books. And so this is essentially where a journalist would get access to a criminal, often behind bars, and get the inside scoop or the interview over a series of months, and then essentially write some sort of crime biography of one shape or form. We have to remember there are distortions, there are interpretations that come with biographical work, and there's edits that occur as well. So these could be often New York Times bestsellers. Most of the time they focus on homicide, and they do give that insider's look at police work as far as what happened, trying to tell kind of the story beyond the initial news articles that came out about the crime. As far as news media is concerned, we have to remember it rarely focuses on police as the focus of the story, the center point of the story. There are exceptions with police brutality, mistakes by different departments, or scandal. So clearly those are stories in their own right, but rarely do you see a focus on police doing a good job or police getting it right. It's just not as exciting as some of those other things, and so we don't really give due diligence to law enforcement the way we should when all things are going well. News media also exclusively focuses now on interviewing an administrator as far as getting a scoop on a story, or maybe utilizing a media specialist, or basically a public relations officer, which most large departments have, that have extensive media training, that know how to deal with the press and the pressures that come from questioning on the spot, not revealing too much, but appearing competent, being factual, and reassuring the investigation is ongoing, this, that, and the other, appearing sympathetic to the pain and harm that have come to victims, and also making sure that they leave people with a sense of what to do next if they have more information that would benefit the investigation. So this model is kind of more recent. We've had media specialists and administrators in this role for a long time, but now it's very prolific. Finally, infotainment programming will fill in the blank. So when we are given these portrayals, whether it's in film, television, journalism, or news media, we kind of choose the most exciting stories and let that do the talking for us. It's a very common comment from students to say, I remember when I first had a law enforcement officer come over to my house, maybe for a burglary or a theft of some kind, and I had them come over to start the investigation. And they were very surprised at what actually happened versus what they thought would happen. Because then they start to recognize how much of their portrayal of police and crime fighting is based on the media versus the reality of what was in front of them with an actual crime that had occurred. So I invite you to think about that as you make your own reports and as you try to address crime in your own community. Have you seen a reality versus media paradigm shift in your own life where you really kind of had to rethink some of your ideas? So I leave that with you, and we'll see you next time.